Nestled among the opulent estates of Sunset Boulevard, Gloria Swanson's former mansion stands as a testament to Hollywood's golden age. The Spanish-style villa, with its arched windows and intricate ironwork, once echoed with the laughter of parties attended by stars like Chaplin and Greta Garbo. But today it is known for something far darker. The house's current owner, a young filmmaker, first noticed something odd while renovating the property. At night, the faint strains of piano music wafted through the air, even though the grand piano in the living room had been silent for decades. The melody was hauntingly familiar, and a friend later identified it as "Love, Your Magic Spell is Everywhere," a song famously performed by Swanson in The Trespasser. Curiosity turned to fear when the filmmaker heard whispers in the hallway late at night. The voice, unmistakably feminine, seemed to carry an urgency. At first, he dismissed it as the creaks and groans of an old house, but the whispers grew louder, sometimes punctuated by a soft, sorrowful laugh. One evening, while reviewing footage in his home office, he noticed the light in the dining room flickering. He walked in to find an old gramophone, a prop from one of Swanson's films that he had placed there for decoration. Its turntable spun slowly, though it hadn't been wound. From it came the faint crackle of Gloria's voice. "I am big. It's the pictures that got small." Chilled to the bone, he backed away, but not before catching the unmistakable scent of Swanson's favorite perfume, a rare floral blend. Neighbors whispered about the history of the house. Swanson was rumored to have been deeply attached to the property, spending her final days longing for the glamour of a bygone era. Guests who stayed overnight often complained of unsettling visions of an elegant woman wandering the halls, her piercing eyes searching for something lost. Perhaps the most harrowing account came from a housekeeper who claimed she saw Swanson's figure in the mirror of the master bedroom. The apparition, dressed in a glittering gown, turned to her and whispered, "Do you see me now?" before vanishing. The filmmaker eventually moved out, leaving the house vacant. Yet, late at night, passers-by swear they still hear the faint echo of a piano, the soft murmur of a bygone star, and the lingering presence of Hollywood's most dramatic ghost. As the filmmaker packed his belongings, determined to leave the eerie house behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. On his final night in the mansion, he decided to record everything, setting up cameras in every room to capture any unusual activity. The night started uneventfully. The house was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. He sat in the living room watching the monitors. Midnight passed, and he began to feel foolish. Maybe it was all in his head. Then, at exactly 12:15 a.m., the piano began to play. It wasn't just a single note this time, but a full melody, cascading through the house like a concert performance. The filmmaker froze, his eyes darting to the monitor showing the piano room. The keys were moving, pressed by invisible fingers. A low whisper joined the music, growing louder and more distinct. It was Swanson's voice again, repeating a line he hadn't heard before. "Why did you leave me?" The lights in the house began to flicker, and the temperature plummeted. On one of the monitors, he noticed movement in the hallway, a shadow gliding across the wall. It stopped just outside the living room door. The filmmaker's breath caught in his throat as the door slowly creaked open. There was no one there. But then, the smell of Swanson's perfume, stronger this time, filled the room. A cold hand seemed to brush his shoulder, and he spun around, only to find empty space. Desperate to leave, he grabbed his car keys and bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The locks, which had worked perfectly earlier, were jammed. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the house in a chorus. "Stay with me." He stumbled back into the living room, searching for his phone to call for help. But as he turned to pick it up, the screen of one monitor went black, followed by another, and then another until only the feed from the master bedroom remained. The camera in that room showed the vanity mirror, and in its reflection stood a figure dressed in an ornate gown, staring directly into the lens. The filmmaker recognized her instantly, Gloria Swanson. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Then the screen cut to static. The filmmaker sat paralyzed, staring at the static-filled monitor, his mind racing. The air in the room grew heavier, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then, from somewhere deep within the mansion, a sharp crash echoed, like glass shattering. Instinctively, he grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the source of the sound, his heart pounding. It led him to the dining room, where the ornate chandelier now swayed violently above the shattered remains of a wine glass on the table. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the tense silence. Grateful for the distraction, he snatched it up, only to see an unknown number calling. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello?" His voice quivered. The line crackled, and then he heard it, a faint, haunting laugh, unmistakably Swanson's. Before he could hang up, the voice whispered, "Do you understand now? Do you see?" The call ended abruptly, but his phone didn't return to the home screen. Instead, the camera feed from the master bedroom was displayed. The mirror was fogged over, and a single word was written in the condensation. "Remember." He staggered backward, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. When he scrambled to pick it up, the beam caught a glimmer of something shiny on the floor near the fireplace. Moving closer, he uncovered an old locket, tarnished with age. Inside was a black and white photo of Gloria Swanson, her eyes seemingly boring into his soul. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the nearby candles. The piano music resumed, louder this time, with the melody twisting into something discordant and menacing. A low hum reverberated through the walls, almost like the house was breathing. Then, from behind him, he heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. He turned, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced eerily across the walls. At the far end of the room, standing just at the edge of the beam's light, was the figure of a woman. She wasn't translucent or vague like he expected a ghost might be. She was vivid, tangible. Her gown sparkled faintly as if catching the faintest glow of a long-forgotten spotlight. But it was her eyes unblinking, full of sorrow and anger that held him in place. "You've come to tell my story," she said, her voice layered with echoes, each syllable vibrating through the air. The filmmaker opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Then listen," she commanded. The lights in the house went out, plunging everything into darkness. The only thing he could hear now was her voice, close to his ear, as if she was standing right behind him. "Do you know what they took from me? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The room felt impossibly cold, as if every ounce of warmth had been drained from it. The filmmaker didn't dare move, though every instinct screamed at him to run. Gloria's voice, impossibly close yet disembodied, continued low, mournful, and tinged with rage. "They promised me eternity," she whispered. "But eternity came, and I was forgotten." The piano music swelled, its once beautiful melody now disjointed and chaotic. The floor beneath his feet seemed to tremble, the walls groaning as though the house itself was coming alive. He turned his flashlight frantically, the beam catching glimpses of movement shadows that shifted unnaturally, their shapes impossible to define. On the far wall, the ornate wallpaper began to peel, revealing a mural beneath it. He stepped closer, compelled despite his terror. The image depicted Gloria Swanson, radiant in her prime, standing on a stage before an audience of faceless figures. But as he watched, the mural began to change. The figures in the audience blurred, their faces twisting into grotesque shapes. Swanson's image darkened, her eyes sinking into shadow, her lips curling into a silent scream. A sudden knock echoed through the house. 3 sharp raps that seemed to come from every direction at once. He spun around, his flashlight catching a glimpse of the grand staircase. At the top stood the figure of Gloria, her gown trailing behind her like smoke. "Follow me," she said, her voice both a command and a plea. He hesitated, but his feet moved as if pulled by an invisible force. He ascended the staircase, each step creaking beneath his weight. As he reached the landing, she vanished, replaced by a door he hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, the faint sound of music seeping through. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open. The room was an attic, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. Dust motes floated in the air, and the smell of age and decay was overpowering. In the center of the room stood an old projector, its film reel spinning though no one had touched it. The images projected onto the wall were of Gloria, captured in moments both glamorous and vulnerable. Her face lit up as she laughed on set, but the scenes grew darker. The laughter faded, replaced by moments of her sitting alone in the same house he now stood in, her expression hollow, her eyes filled with unspeakable sadness. As he watched, the images began to speed up, flickering violently. Then, the film burned, the acrid smell of smoke filling the air. From behind him, her voice came again, anguished and accusing. They erased me. They took my light and left me with nothing but shadows. The attic door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The air grew oppressive, heavy with an unnatural weight. A faint glow appeared in the corner of the room. It was the locket he had found earlier, now pulsating with a pale, otherworldly light. He reached for it, but as his fingers brushed the metal, a hand cold and solid clasped over his own. "Don't leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not like they did." The room began to spin, the walls bending and warping as if the house itself was collapsing into a void. And then he heard it, a chorus of voices, overlapping, desperate, and pleading. "Stay with us." The filmmaker tried to wrench his hand free, but the grip tightened, unnaturally strong and ice-cold. The glow from the locket grew brighter, illuminating the room in ghostly silver light. Shadows swirled on the walls, taking the forms of figures that seemed to reach for him, their faces anguished and desperate. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices layering over one another. "Stay, listen, remember." The projector flickered back to life on its own, casting an image onto the far wall. It was no longer a film reel of Gloria Swanson, but something far stranger, a live scene of the very room he stood in, though it looked different. Dust and decay were replaced by opulence, the furniture polished and pristine, the walls adorned with vibrant artwork. And then he saw her, Gloria Swanson herself, seated at a vanity in the corner, brushing her hair. Her reflection in the mirror didn't match her movements. It stared directly at him, as if it could see through time. The dissonance was jarring, and he couldn't tear his eyes away. The Gloria in the reflection spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "They will never let me go," she said. "And now they've seen you." As she spoke, the shadows on the walls grew darker and more defined, their movements frantic. He realized with dawning horror that they weren't random, they were circling him. "Who?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, her reflection reached out, pressing a hand against the mirror. The glass rippled like water, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. "You have to finish what they wouldn't," she said, her voice cracking. "Or you'll never leave this house." Before he could ask what she meant, the mirror shattered outward, shards flying toward him. He shielded his face, but the fragments passed through him harmlessly, each one carrying an image as it fell to the floor. A faceless man holding a contract. A darkened theater, its seats filled with shadowy figures. The faint outline of a noose dangling in a backstage room. The pieces of the mirror reassembled themselves on the floor, forming a perfect circle. At its center, the locket pulsed with a blinding light. And then, for the first time, the shadows spoke in unison, their voices deep and resonant, vibrating through his very bones. "Open the door." The attic began to shake violently, the floorboards splintering beneath his feet. A door he hadn't noticed before appeared in the far wall, its frame glowing faintly. Every instinct told him not to go near it, but the locket seemed to tug him forward, its chain wrapping around his wrist like a leash. As he reached for the doorknob, the voices quieted. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. And then, from behind the door, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of applause, growing louder and louder, as though an invisible audience were waiting for him to step inside. The applause thundered louder as the filmmaker's trembling hand hovered over the doorknob. It wasn't joyous or celebratory, it was slow, deliberate, and menacing, like an unseen audience mocking his hesitation. His breath hitched as the locket's chain tightened, pulling his wrist closer to the door. The air around him grew thicker, pressing against his chest, and the shadows on the walls twisted violently, their shapes becoming more grotesque with every passing second. When his fingers finally closed around the knob, the house fell silent. The applause stopped, the projector flickered off, and even the oppressive whispers ceased. The quiet was deafening. He twisted the knob, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway bathed in faint golden light. The walls were lined with old photographs, each one slightly blurred, as if the subjects had shifted just as the camera clicked. He stepped inside, compelled by the locket's relentless pull. The first photograph showed Gloria Swanson standing on a film set, surrounded by crew members, but their faces were blank, smooth as porcelain dolls. As he moved deeper into the hall, the images became stranger. One showed Swanson seated at a grand dining table, alone, her face lit by candlelight. The plates in front of her were full, but the other chairs at the table were empty except for faint outlines, like figures that had been erased. Another photo froze him in his tracks. It was a picture of himself. He was standing in the very hallway he now walked, his face pale with fear. But behind him, in the photo, Gloria loomed, her eyes glowing faintly, her hand resting on his shoulder. A low hum began to fill the air, rising steadily in pitch. The locket burned against his skin, the heat unbearable. He tore it from his wrist and dropped it, but it didn't fall. It hovered in midair, spinning slowly, its glow intensifying. Ahead, the hallway ended at another door, this one larger, heavier, and covered in intricate carvings. Faces were etched into the wood, their expressions frozen in terror. He took a step closer, and the locket shot toward the door, embedding itself in the center like a key. The carvings shifted, their mouths opening wide in silent screams. The door groaned as it began to swing inward, revealing a cavernous room beyond, shrouded in shadow. In the center of the room was a single spotlight, illuminating a grand, empty stage. Dust particles floated in the light, and a faint breeze carried the unmistakable scent of Gloria's perfume. And then he saw them, rows of chairs stretched into the darkness, filled with figures draped in heavy shadows. Their heads turned in unison to face him, their eyes glowing faintly. The applause began again, slow and rhythmic, echoing off the unseen walls. At the edge of the stage, Gloria stood, her figure bathed in the spotlight. She looked directly at him, her expression unreadable. "Every performance must have its audience," she said softly, her voice carrying through the room. "But some never leave." The applause grew louder, almost deafening now. The shadows in the chairs began to rise, their forms stretching unnaturally as they moved toward the stage and toward him. Gloria extended a hand, beckoning him forward. "Now it's your turn." The filmmaker stood frozen, caught between the encroaching shadows and Gloria's outstretched hand. The applause, relentless and mocking, pounded in his ears. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The locket pulsed brightly on the stage, its light dimming and flaring like a heartbeat. Gloria's expression softened, and for a fleeting moment, he saw not the spectral figure but the woman she once was, full of pain, longing, and a desperate need to be remembered. "Step into the light," she urged, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. He hesitated, his instincts screaming that this was a trap. But then the shadows moved closer, their features becoming more defined: hollow eyes, gaping mouths, hands reaching for him. Each face seemed familiar, and he realized with growing horror that they were the crew members and actors from the photographs. "Choose," Gloria said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Be part of the stage or part of the audience." The shadows were upon him now, their icy fingers brushing his skin. With no other option, he stepped toward the stage, his legs heavy as if wading through water. The spotlight flared, blinding him as he climbed the steps. The moment his foot touched the stage, the applause stopped. The room plunged into silence so complete it felt unnatural. like the world itself had paused. Gloria stood before him, her hand still extended. He reached out reluctantly, his fingers brushing hers. Her grip was cold but firm, and the locket flew into her other hand, its glow intensifying until it engulfed them both. The room dissolved around him, and suddenly, he was no longer in the mansion. He stood on a film set, surrounded by bright lights and cameras. Gloria was beside him, radiant and alive, her gown shimmering as if woven from stars. "You're part of the story now," she said, her voice carrying an edge of sorrow. The set was familiar, it was the same one from the photographs in the hallway. He looked down and saw he was dressed in period clothing, a script clutched in his hand. Around him, the faceless crew moved with mechanical precision, their blank faces turned toward him expectantly. The director called, "Action!" and suddenly, he was speaking, the words flowing from his mouth though he hadn't meant to. The scene played out like a dream he couldn't wake from, Gloria's presence commanding yet haunting. The shadows that had once pursued him now sat silently in the chairs beyond the stage, their glowing eyes fixed on him. As the final line left his lips, Gloria stepped closer, her face inches from his. "They'll remember me now," she whispered. "And so will you." The lights dimmed, the set fading into darkness. He tried to move, to speak, but his body wouldn't obey. His vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled backward, his consciousness unraveling. When he came to, he was seated in the audience. His body felt heavy, his movements sluggish. The stage was empty except for Gloria, who stood bathed in the spotlight once more. She looked directly at him, and for the first time her smile was genuine. "Every show needs an audience," she said. "And now you'll never leave." The applause began again, and he realized, with cold, sinking dread, that he was clapping. Against his will, his hands moved rhythmically, joining the shadowy figures around him. As Gloria's laughter filled the room, the lights dimmed further, until only the sound of applause remained, echoing endlessly in the void. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.